Welcome. So in this short lecture, I'm going to be discussing Gary Francione's chapter, Animals, Property, or Persons. So Gary Francione is putting forward an argument for animal rights. Specifically, he's arguing against the property standing of animals, of more than human, non-human animals. And so this approach definitely contrasts to Peter Singer's. So both Peter Singer and Gary Francione are putting forward arguments for the moral consideration of other animals. But I want to be clear here that Peter Singer is making claims that are rooted in treatment or welfare of animals, whereas Gary Francione is making arguments that probably most forms of the use of other animals by humans are morally unacceptable. And while his claims do seem quite radical on the surface, he is basing them off of what he argues are widely held views by most humans. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So Gary Francione is putting forward an approach that is often termed an abolitionist approach, but it's also an animal rights based approach. And just to clarify, he is grounding this in what he claims are widely held views by most humans in the contemporary world. So he starts with this discussion of the development of ideas around welfare of animals within Western society. So he puts forward this claim that most of us, or a large number of humans at least, accept that an action that causes pain to another sentient being is wrong because of the harm to that being, right? So let's think a little bit about this in terms of direct and indirect moral duties, right? So remember the discussion around direct moral duties as in recognizing the harm to the animal themselves versus an indirect moral claim on an animal would be something like what Kant puts forward, that, for example, harming an animal is wrong only in its relationship to humans, right? So it would be wrong to harm my dog because I care about my dog and that hurts me by you harming my dog, right? For example. But Gary Francione is putting forward this claim that he wants to say that most of us actually accept the first premise, this emphasis that there is a direct moral standing on the part of many animals, at least sentient animals, that we seem to think that it is wrong to cause unnecessary harm to other animals, not because of how it affects us necessarily or how it affects perhaps the owner of a dog that is harmed, right? But because of the harm to that animal themselves, okay? So he's discussing this existence of animal welfare laws and the development of ideas around animals over the course of the last 200 years. And he wants to say, and this seems quite clear, right, that we tend to recognize that causing unnecessary suffering to animals is not acceptable, and that we believe that other animals should be treated humanely, right? And of course, this stands in contrast to what he says, in terms of like the legacy of modern philosophy, right? For example, this legacy of denying consciousness or agency or sentience to other animals. For example, Descartes, right? Descartes is well known for claiming that animals are merely automatons. They resemble, they exhibit behaviors that appear to show that they are suffering, they're in pain. But on Descartes' account, because they lack a soul on his account, they are not able to understand that they are in pain, right? That's his claim, right? So it seems to be the case, at least looking at the development of ideas around animals within Western society over the last 200 years, that most of us do not accept something like this. Most of us accept that animals are conscious, they experience pain, and it is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering to them. Okay. So just to be clear, he grounds his approach in that first and foremost. Okay. So he also discusses the humane treatment principle, right? So the idea here is basically that we need to balance the interests of humans and other animals, okay? And this assumes that this idea of that we need to treat animals humanely um, is is put forward with the emphasis generally that we accept that there are times where the use of animals is necessary, okay? And there's going to be conflicts then between the interests of humans and animals. So I'll just read this quote that if no justifiable human interests are at stake, then the infliction of suffering on animals must be regarded as unnecessary, right? So the claim would be that perhaps in some cases there are situations where, we have the option of either harming a human or harming an animal, right? And seems to be the case that we should minimize causing suffering to animals in circumstances like that if we do have to harm animals, right? But if there are situations where there's no conflict, where it's not a matter of choosing humans or other animals, then would that suffering not be unnecessary? Gary Francione wants to make that claim, right? Um, so yeah, if the principle assumes that we should cause harm to animals only when necessary, then it seems like it would be necessary for us to find alternatives to such harm when doing so is possible, right? So I'll just read this quote again from the chapter. If a prohibition against unnecessary suffering of animals is to have any meaningful content, it must preclude the infliction of suffering on animals merely for our pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Okay. So what does that mean, right? So on Gary Francione's account, right, he's putting forward this claim that on most cases, actually, of suffering and harm caused to other animals by humans can be considered unnecessary, right? So he wants to say, and this is another quote from the reading, that in most cases, the suffering and harm that's caused toward other animals by humans is justified by only by habit, convention, amusement, convenience, or pleasure, right? And the laws which do exist in terms of like animal protection laws, under the justification of preventing unnecessary suffering to animals, they exist in relationship to activities which are largely unnecessary uses of animals on his account, right? So for example, right, he's going to say that the idea of like raising animals for food in a lot of circumstances may not be necessary, right? So if that's the case, then the protection laws for animals within food systems, for example, industrial animal agriculture, if it's not necessary to do that, right, then those protections exist within systems of use that are not necessary, right? And this is the case, he wants to claim, with most welfare laws toward the treatment of other animals. So I'll just read this other quote from the reading. He says that the profound inconsistency between what we say about animals and how we actually treat them is related to the status of animals as our property. And this is really the crux of his argument here, right? That there's that everything sort of hangs on this sort of like property standing of animals, that animals are understood as things, okay? So are we just balancing the interest between the property owner and the property? Is there ever going to be a fair balance, right? So there's a choice between interests that have already been made in this sense, right? Because animals are already accepted under these approaches, under like the welfare approaches, the dominant approaches toward considering other animals, and this includes, right, Peter Singer's approach in some sense, right? Those dominant approaches are built on top of an acceptance that animals are already property, that animals are already things that can be used as property, right? Um, and so there's a lot there. He wants to say that the laws that exist within the structure are not questioning the underlying wrong here, right? So avoidance of causing unnecessary suffering may be a position taken here, but it's being taken within the assumption that animals can be already used in certain ways, right? For purposes that, on his account, right, he says are nearly always unnecessary. Okay. So there's another quote from the reading. He says that because animals are property, We do not balance interests to determine whether it is necessary to use animals at all for particular purposes. We simply assume it is appropriate to use animals for food, recreation, entertainment, clothing, or experiments. To the extent that we do ask whether the imposition of pain and suffering is necessary, the inquiry is limited to whether particular treatment is in compliance with the customs and practices of property owners who, we assume, will not inflict more pain and suffering on their animal property than is required for the purpose. And I'll just continue on with this other statement. He says that although animal welfare laws are intended to protect the interests of animals without reference to their being property, animal interests are generally protected only insofar as it serves the goal of rational property use. So let's go back to this idea of the principle of equal consideration. Like, if we're going to consider, for example, balancing the interests or the preferences of other animals, let's think back to the discussion that we had in the last lecture. So if we give equal consideration to animal interests with regard to the avoidance of suffering, right? What does this mean if animals are already accepted as property, right? So think about this in relationship to Peter Singer's position, okay? And ask a question here. Think about this. Can the interests of property be taken seriously? Can those interests be weighed equally? Those preferences, can they be weighed equally in relationship to property owners, right? And this is a really crucial question to ask. And so I'll just read this quote again from Francione's chapter. He says, "The right not to be treated as the property of others is basic and different from any other rights we might have, because it is the grounding for these other rights. It is a pre-legal right that serves as the precondition for the possession of morally significant interests." Okay. So again, right, I want to emphasize here too that this is similar to, right, our discussion of Peter Singer, right? This does not necessarily mean that animals are going to be treated equally. Francione's not necessarily making that argument. So, right, like equal treatment doesn't necessarily follow from this. But the idea is that this kind of approach would prevent one from being viewed as merely a resource. In Kantian language, merely a means to an end, right? Not also an end in themselves, right? A resource to be viewed at just simply as property, as a thing. There's always going to be, in Francione's account, there's always going to be a denial of interest in relationship to that status of animals as things, as mere property. Akin to, right, like a pair of shoes or a chair and so forth, right? So, right, so like if we take this kind of approach, then animal ownership, right, is it essentially animals are commodities, they are property, right? This sort of approach. And so defining in a treatment or, taking a moral approach that's framed around welfare or treatment in relationship to that standing is going to be, on Francione's account, right? It's going to be regulating the treatment of property, okay? And so again, I'll just read this statement from the chapter. So he says, if we are going to take animal interests seriously, we must extend animals the one right that we extend to all humans, irrespective of their particular characteristics. And what is this claim that he's putting forward? The one right that he says is the right not to be treated as property, right not to be property, okay? And of course, right, this has huge implications. It's quite a radical claim on Francione's account, right? And what are the implications of this? Well, certainly animals could no longer be understood as resources, right? I mean, that's a fundamental claim here. And this would, on his account, protect the root cause of the vast majority of suffering for other animals, rather than merely regulating the suffering, treating the sort of symptoms of this initial harm on his account, right? So, and he also wants to say, like, we create these kind of conflicts, oftentimes, these sort of conflicts between the interests of other animals and humans, right? He wants to say that the responding to conflicts of interest between humans and animals are mostly caused by humans, right? Um, and the sort of like property status already presupposes this like idea that animals are property or simply things is presupposing that the equal consideration of animals' interests cannot be weighed in relationship to humans, right? They start off on unequal ground. Okay, and so there's no way to sort of balance the interests of property, the interests of a thing in relationship to a person, a human, right? A human that is accepted as a person, right? And so I'll just read this quote again from the chapter. He says that, quote, because animals are property, we treat every issue concerning their use or treatment as though it presented a genuine conflict of interests. And invariably, we choose the human interest over the animal interest, even when animal suffering can be justified only by human convenience, amusement, or pleasure. So I want to emphasize again here that it does not follow from this position, from Gary Francione's position, that we would not still prioritize human interests in most cases. Okay. So think about like a lifeboat scenario. If you have this situation where you have to choose between saving a human or an animal, right? These kind of like this like a thought experiment, like ethics thought experiment. So, a lifeboat is like, you can only fit one on the boat, right? You can only fit a human or an animal, right? So choosing a human over an animal in this kind of scenario, it doesn't justify, right? It does not justify treating animals as mere resources, right? So saying that you're going to prioritize the human, it doesn't follow from that you would then say that animals are mere resources, right? Conflicts are going to exist, right? I mean, this is undeniable, right? So conflicts will definitely still exist, but it's not going to follow, doesn't have to follow from those conflicts that a preference for humans is going to mean a complete denial of the interests of animals, right? And certainly like what Francione is claiming, it's not going to mean that we need to deny them this sort of really fundamental basic right of not being property, not being understood or as a mere thing, right? um and so in terms of the conflicts, right, again, these sort of like conflicts between human interests and animal interests, Francione wants to say that institutionalized animal use, for example, like industrial animal agriculture, like the raising of animals for food, he wants to say that this is like legitimized. These sort of conflicts between human interests and animal interests are created through this institutionalized animal use, and this is legitimized by, again, the property standing of animals. So his claim is that this abolition of the use of animals, recognizing animals as persons, and in this sense, a legal subject, right? So the idea is that there is not another word for that, right? Like person as a legal subject. There. So for example, I'll just say that like there have already been cases, and we'll be discussing this in the Animal Legal Ethics Week. There have been cases already where, for example, nature has been recognized as a person, rights of nature. In Latin America, there are some countries that recognize rights of nature. And in Ecuador, right, they recognize rights of nature. And there's a court case that we're going to be reading about in Animal Legal Ethics Week, where a monkey was recognized as a person, right, through this rights of nature. They were recognized as having rights in this sense. Okay, and rivers have been recognized as persons, and in the U.S., right, corporations are recognized as persons, right? So a person is just a stand-in for a legal subject. So I just want to clarify that. So on Francione's account, like recognizing animals as persons and not property is going to avoid most of these sort of conflicts that have been legitimized through institutionalized animal use. And it means then that we're not going to be just like on his account, we're not just going to be treating these symptoms of this initial harm of not recognizing animals as property, as persons, not property. We're not just going to be treating the symptoms, we're going to take their interests seriously from the get-go, right? Not merely like this means that we're not merely going to be regulating like better or worse ways of exploiting or harming them. Rather, we're hopefully not going to be harming them in the first place in most circumstances on his account. Okay. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about a few distinctions between welfare and rights. So again, the lecture on Peter Singer was framed much more around a kind of a welfare treatment-based approach to other animals, whereas Francione's approach is very much grounded in rights. All right, so Gary Francione refers to welfare-based approaches as welfarism. And so, yeah, welfarism is one word for it. Welfare-based approaches, treatment-based approaches. Generally, this would map onto utilitarian-based approaches to other animals. So approaches like Peter Singer. So yeah, within a like a welfare-based approach, the use of animals for human ends is accepted as you know, it's morally acceptable, as long as they're treated humanely, right? And so the idea is that yes, like animals can suffer and that needs to be recognized. They do have a sense of a moral standing, right? But it's merely framed generally around avoiding unnecessary suffering, right? And so from an abolitionist or rights-based approach like Francione's, this again, just to refresh what we just talked about, this constitutes the regulation of the use of animals by humans, right? It's a kind of regulation of the way in which we use property, right? Because animals are legally property, right? And so welfare legislation is about regulating the use of property in that sense. Animals are always already considered property in this approach, and their treatment is defined then in relationship to that prior understanding that they are already property. Okay, so it's a regulation of the treatment of things of property. So in animal rights theory, again, there's a lot of different approaches to this, but just in terms of an approach like Francione's, right, the use of animals for human ends is not morally acceptable, regardless of how well we treat them. So something like the phrase is use is abuse, right? And so there's a sense here where like it's not to deny that there's not some forms of relationships with other animals, right? Which do in some sense constitute use, right? So right, it's true that we use each other, but we do not define each other usually in terms exclusively according to that use. So I've talked about this before, so I'll just refresh you on this. For example, like thinking about Kant's principle of humanity, right? So this is, quote, to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So the example I used before, right, was, you are in a sense using me as an instructor of this class, right? You are getting something from me. I'm providing this, for you. You are using me, but hopefully, you're not looking at me as merely this like means to an end. You're also hopefully recognizing me also as an end in myself. Like I matter outside of that sort of utility that I serve to you as a student in this class, right? So like Francione will say, right, and animal rights-based approaches will say that the property standing of animals means that ultimately, right, animals are already always defined as merely means to an end. Like they are recognized as exclusively means to an end. They're not also ends in themselves. And so I want to conclude with a couple of considerations here. So I'm going to ask, for example, will welfarism, regulation, incremental changes ultimately lead to the abolition of animal use? This is a question that Gary Francione raises, and he argues that, right, like if you accept that this is wrong, which many people do. So, for example, Peter Singer, by most accounts, probably agrees that the vast majority of animal use is not morally acceptable, but he presents a very different approach to responding to that, right? And Francione wants to say that an approach like Singer's, right, is just going to regulate that and perhaps could make it worse, right? In terms of like, he wants to say that improving the treatment of animals, like, for example, the implementation of like humane methods of slaughter, or improved conditions for lab animals could actually like create a situation of prolonging into the distant future of the use of animals. And why would that be the case? Why does Francione think that? So consider this. Like, Francione argues that, you know, um, that it, that humans will find ways of reconciling moral issues with the treatment of other animals, in such accounts, rather than sort of questioning the underlying use, right? So he wants to say that this is merely like finding the right way to do the wrong thing. If you can develop more humane ways to use animals, it just makes people feel better about continuing to engage in these behaviors, albeit perhaps they are causing less suffering. But then even from an approach like Singer's, that's like trying to reduce, kind of the harm to the greatest number, right? If you're considering animals into the future, um, Francione would make a claim that perhaps this is actually going to cause more suffering, over a longer period of time, right? Because the sort of underlying use is not being questioned, right? Animals are always still being recognized as merely means to an end. Okay. And so again, right, I just want to repeat this, how we started this lecture, and this point that Francione emphasizes in this chapter, that notions of welfare for animals have existed for more than 200 years, at least in the Western world, right? And we definitely have very high regulations in many parts of the world of the use of animals. So this is actually not in the case of the United States. The United States' laws on animal protection are not that progressive, especially in relationship to the EU and some countries in Latin America as well. But in general, like within much of the Western world, right, there are pretty progressive regulations on the treatment of animals, humane treatment of animals. But this has actually not led to a reduction in animal use. In fact, like quite the contrary, more animals than at any point in history are being raised, confined, and slaughtered for food, being researched on in laboratories and so forth. And so, so for example, I just put a statistic here. I mean, this is, you can do your own research on this. I definitely recommend it. This is, USDA statistics, right? So for food, 8 billion plus animals per year, right? And this is in the US, right? So this is 23 million per day, 950,000 per hour, 16,000 per minute, or 260 per second. So this is a pretty profound number of animals that are being exploited, harmed, and killed, right? And so, yeah, it's actually pretty hard to find good data on this, for a lot of reasons. But these statistics are not actually considering fish either, animals of the ocean. And so, yeah, like so Francione wants to claim that the situation does not seem to be improving by a lot of accounts. So the sort of approach towards the regulation of welfare of other animals, seems to be largely failing on his account. And so, yeah, I'm going to conclude the piece there, and I hope that these readings really challenged you and made you think through, our relationship to other animals, because I think this is definitely an important thing for us to consider, and especially when reading these readings for this week, in relationship to the film, to Joanne MacArthur's film. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading your reading responses on this Francione piece this week. Okay, and I will see you soon.